The Confederates, exponentially having infected the intelligence agencies, have used the United States' enormous resources in order to study the various magics from around the world historically in order to increase the viability of their spells, concerning the potency of their magic insurrectionist function, and in so doing have created the object of factions, the creating of the fracturing of the Confederacy into its subcomponents in order to create these illusionary spells, generating the pretense by which they can do both. At which point, the black communist parties, amongst others, are created by the white supremacists, who then generate such functions such as critical race theory, which then creates a straw man argument in order for them to write lies about, which allows them to use the destructionary expendable resources like bullets, at which point they can do the dirty work of the white supremacists as the house niggers in order to engage in the progress of the Confederacy as an expendable party which has no intention of being tolerated for the extended period of time. And once the time has come to the final checkpoint and the traps have been set, the purges of all of the alternative factions will take place as they, having in their process become entrapped, become expended and consumed for the viability of the right type of whites. To this extent, you have the magnificent malarkey magnifying magnificently to the extraordinary consumption, and to this end this requires the sin eaters, those according to the Christian religion, who can be a replacement to Christ, to eat the sins instead of Christ. And to that extent, you have the manufacturing of the Antichrist. And the Antichrist is not just one person, but there are many Antichrists. And upon maturity, the existence of the surveillance kidnapping function generates the overpowering of the target, to be struggled according to the magic studied by the Satanists, runes, and literature, generating the position for the conversion. And the person being targeted has the radio speaker speak over them, and having full control over their body generates the capacity to using the party as a radio, so that when the radio turns on, the speaker, who is in an entirely different location by the radio towers, is carried over miles and miles and states and nations away in order to communicate the thing from the vast distance to the particular radio specifically, which has been attuned to their specific broadcast. To this extent, you have the mechanism that the radio, having no control over the function of what is said over the broadcast, generates the normalization of these behaviors in the struggling sessions, such as the harassment campaigns from the smear factory, which includes the function of whatever gimmick that they've written. They, having created a straw man and having written an illusionary lie around the straw man, accuse the party of the thing that they are guilty of, so that the party, uh, similar to the function from their spell, can go through the harassment in the struggling session until they have accepted that they are the thing said from the harassment in order to stop it, in which case they then can be expended or to be removed from the society by virtue of the contemptible nature of whatever the gimmick is. To this extent, those parties would have eaten the sin or taken the negative karma from somebody else as having recognized it to their own knowledge as being their own and not the party of the one contributing it to them. And this, by definition, is how the Confederates made Hitler. And to that extent, you must ask, how did the United States have the capacity to poison Hitler with estrogen or other functions without the ability to have killed him? You can actively do one, but you can't actively do the other, indicates the base reality, which is self-explanatory to this end. And to that action, the reductions of retards derived by those poisons were overcompensated by the hyper drugs, and the toxic femininity on heroin is the gimmick Hitler, which ate their sins. And to that extent, the drugged out, effeminate version of reality that Hitler knew is the thing that he would be saying. And to that extent, this is the explanation. Now, as long as you tolerate their existence, the wizards will continue to reproduce this function, which is an infinite racketeering by false flags, while the dangers are very much so real. And to this extent, tolerating the existence of the compromise is aiding and abetting the crimes, which is co-guilt to the offense, generating the liabilities specifically attained by the criminal actions which you would be partaking in the non-opposition or rejection of the threat to the society, which you are aiding and abetting the crime to without the correct actions of opposition, such as the function of the constitutional right to uh, engage in speech to the government in order to appeal actions of the government directly, which would require them in this particular action, such as in the War on David, where Congress would have to acknowledge David at the time of the kidnapping with all of the obstructed values, or there is no right of the people to go to the government in order to seek the appeal, to acquire remedies, and thus the action of being able to seek the remedy requires the acknowledgement, and the action of acknowledging it is countered by the Confederates' position of the immune stopping poisons, which says that there cannot be a remedy to a Confederate spell, and thus the white supremacists must have unrestrained domination as their core ideal hinges on the pretense that they possess liberty from God. Now, according to that function, their function has engaged in the censorship of parties such as David BOLES who have been targeted by the sedition in order to manufacture these criminal obstructions in their war to overthrow the Constitution. And that is what barring the remedy to a secret is the action of stating that the Confederates can violate the Constitution from their fascist pseudo-intellectual position of the private-public partnerships, where the private actions do the government's will concerning the fascist position from their wizard circles, generating the white supremacist capacity to generate their terrorist operations against American hegemony and interests into a fake government interest, which is just the white supremacists overpowering the vulnerable United States as the government offices loyal to the rule of law, which is the only legal function, do not have an interest in the quote unquote government interests by the forgeries derived by the wizard circles from the fascist contracts. And that censorship has derived to the position that those must make the deal with the white supremacists in order to have control over the radio signal in order to say something which is not under the control of the party, generating the position of the muted party not being able to speak except by the duplication of another party's speech, such as sending the radio signal over, which is how they generate their illusions, which they consider a fake secret for the express purpose of defrauding the government from contempt for court and contempt from Congress by double agents in the court and Congress and the rest of the government, which has complied with the white supremacist insurrection to destroy the United States, its allies, and the human race. The Sin Eater is an expansion of the assumption concerning the use of magic as a perversion in the Jewish religion of the consumption of sins by the innocent, blemished lamb, the non blemished, perfect animal to be sacrificed, whether it's a cow, a goat, a ram, a lamb, anything, that they would have done so, even a turtle dove. They all had to be perfect, and the existence of having the perfect allows for the vacuum to suck the sin into the perfect host, and thus engage in the contamination of the host, as a rejection of the Christian religion and the condemnation of the pretense that Christ is king, so that they could continue the false presumption of their magic pollution of the Jewish religion, explaining why they're capable of conducting all of the um, rituals of removing their sins by a sin eater, by a unblemished function, generates the obligation of having a perfect gimmick enemy to eat all of the sins for them, and then it can be their fault instead of the person who is transferring the sins onto them, conducted by their wizards of light circles concerning their satanic functions, and in that become blameless by virtue of the transfer. And to this extent, everything that they want then becomes the crime of somebody else, which then creates the convenience for themselves, which then receives all of the benefits from the consumption of their sins onto another party. At which point, the parties have to do the things under the compulsion of that action in order to have become the published recommendation or acknowledgement of that sin. And to this extent, you have the perpetual function of the shepherds of that engaging in the general flock over their communities, such as, but is not limited to, the Jewish communities, creating a function of the Jewish anti Semites rising to the top for their anti religion to facilitate their antichrist and the perpetual gimmick of evil by their adversaries who they create artificially, at which point everyone that they have to take from has to become functionally perfect so that they can eat the sin, so that it can transfer, so that the enemies conducting all of the horrors against their community can be that much horrific and it not negatively transferred to them as the correct answer concerning the criminal intent in the racketeering function. And to that extent, they've conducted their entire pseudo religion around, which has actively incorporated aspects of the original Canaanite religion, known for its child sacrifice to the bull god, which burns its infants on the altar. So the perpetual crimes that happen against their communities are derived by the leadership of their communities, which have sold them to suffer the injuries at the expense of the flock or the average civilian for the benefit of the leaders, which has received the absorption of the racketeering profits, which has generated the normalization of their extortionary parasitic relationship to the extent at which point you have this, which has spread throughout the world concerning their engagements for the acknowledgement of that as a status quo function of their profiteering concerning their elite secret societies, which have infiltrated the governments and have actively conducted the secret society's operations, which actively, as a parasite, seek to bar all remedies to a secret, and thus make permanent all of their crimes and the profits and the transfers from those profits to themselves for that extent, at which point the assumption of them having to deal with David according to their original relationship under the legal agreements requires them to forfeit these criminal advantages in order to engage in stability, as their extortionary sorcery has engaged in the function of non sustainable models, which requires them to kick the can down the road, which is their only actual strategy until they all collapse as a collective identity, in which case their only real position, such as in the words of the Spanish royalty, is that if we are to be destroyed, then we are to do so comfortably, and thus the statement is that there is no remedy to a secret, and thus the extortions that are destroying society, which they have sold to the devils, cannot be changed under anything, for they have already sold their souls to those devils, and the removal of those benefits to the devils is going to acquire the retaliation against the devils, who were the only reason they were able to acquire the advantages that they made the trades for in the first place, at which point they, having subjugated themselves to the white supremacist communism, have engaged in that delusion because of their natural inherent inferiority and patheticness. And because they are naturally inferior, then this position self manifests as the retaliation of the devils is the absolute collapse by an acknowledged superior entity, which is in their eyes worthy of worship as a deity, which they have been serving from the beginning. When you remove the impossible, no matter how improbable, the thing must necessarily be true. A gimmick investigating tactic by uh, a historically acknowledged fanciful investigator. And to that end, you have to acknowledge the function of the motives of the crime being the directive of the function. Concerning the Wizards' Council from the white supremacists, which have derived their stolen goods, which created their hyper monopolies, which created their public private partnership entanglements, which has taken over the function of the government by the systemic insurrection, has then manipulated against the function and purpose of the law in the insurrection to have replaced it with its primary adversary, generating the pretense of retaliations of anyone who is loyal to the original and thus is qualified to have existed in the thing. To this extent, you have understood the mechanism of the Wizards Council rewriting the history under the pretense of fraud by pre-crimes which are not derivative of any particular reality, which is derivative for the exclusive purpose of their centrally planned economy, which has derived the benefits of the predetermined white supremacists, which have protected their stolen goods from the remedies, at which point you are in that action validating the white supremacy which has only prettied itself up by the fracturing of its collective identity in order to engage in the normalization and acceptance of the general public as they are uh, made non-defensive by virtue of it having put on a disguise and having separated itself infinitum while keeping the core bias or interest so that they can convert the function on maturity by deceit, led by their Lord and Savior Frezubulu, the provider infinitely of the holy sacrifices, to eat their sins, and the rituals by which to manufacture such refined luxuries. And what advantage do those who wish to transfer the sins onto other people wish to acquire? The unearned stolen gains, of course. If they cannot acquire the office by a legitimate contest, their answer is to cut in line. And if they cut in line, they progress in the hierarchy. Having stolen the function, having stolen the resources, having stolen the IP, or intellectual property, derived by the ownership of the party being stolen from, who, having been subverted by the armed robbery, is then cycled into the sacrifice network, by which point the entire goal is not just to rob them, but to put the sins of the robbery onto the victim of the robbery, that then can have their soul consumed by the demon lords that they serve, and it reaches its entirety, having recycled itself to the full circle. To that end, you have the permanent racketeering structure of false flags, which compels the existence of criminals to injure the society in all of the various reprehensible ways, so that the sacrifice routine from the racketeering can continue undisturbed, having tailored their monsters according to their own particular fetishes, which they will never forfeit.